Professor in Integrative Biology, and I'm chairing this committee, the Library Task Force Space Subcommittee. And we thought this meeting is meant to be slightly different from the other two meetings that were held, in that we want to run this mostly as an opportunity for you to give us feedback, because as you'll see, our whole document is about involving the broader UT community in important decisions that are happening in the libraries, and so then we should hold ourselves to the same standards that we want others to be held. So let me begin quickly by introducing the committee, and about half of the committee members are here today and the others are not. I'll just read them, and the ones that are here I'll ask to stand up. So the first is Ginny Barnes, who's our student representative, and she couldn't make it. And then we have Charles Ramirez-Berg. Anthony Brown also couldn't make it. Then we have Elizabeth Catless, Joan Newberger, and Patricia Roberts-Miller, who couldn't make it, and me. And then we were assisted by two members of the library staff, whose names I don't have here. So one is Becky, and one is Sean, and I don't remember the last names. Okay. So let me begin by, I have a very brief presentation. It's 4 slides total, so this shouldn't take a lot of time. And then really most of our time will be used for you to give us feedback. Hopefully you've read the document. I'll assume you haven't, because probably you couldn't find it. I couldn't find it, but it is there. I have the link up here at the end if you want to find it after the fact. But I have the key takeaways from our document in the presentation. So if you have read the charge of the committee, you may be expecting something different from what I'm going to present, and that's because we felt that the charge was a little overly ambitious and we couldn't really meet the charge. Instead, we defined what we thought the charge should be and met that. Okay, so here are our key committee findings. The first one is that UT, we think, needs to review all library spaces on a regular basis. That has not really happened. So changes to library spaces have happened whenever somebody felt something needed to change, but there hasn't been a regular review process, and we think there should be one. And then with that, it should be formalized. So there needs to be a formalized review process that clearly describes how a review should take place and who should be part of it, and how should the results be communicated to both the university leadership and the broader UT community. And then following that, space changes also need to be enacted through a formalized process that includes careful review and public feedback. That also hasn't really happened. It's mostly been just some unit felt something needed to change, and then they changed something, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes that causes a lot of upset. And so we feel that if there's a formal process, then at least people can feel confident that things were reviewed carefully and any concerns that there might be have been heard. Okay. So the way I want to run this now, I want to quickly go over our proposed process for how we think space should be reviewed, and then I'll open it for feedback, and then a little later I'll go over our proposed process for how space changes should be enacted, and I'll open it for feedback, and then at the very end I'll just open it for general feedback. If you feel there's something that we completely missed and that should be in our final report, then you can do that at the end. And if we use about 20 minutes for each of those units, then that would be about an hour from now, which would be a reasonable amount of time, and if it runs a little longer, then that's maybe also fine. Okay, so let's start with the proposed process for ongoing space reviews. And each item that I'll go through is written out in a little more detail in the document. I just kind of cut them down so they fit on one slide. So first, we feel that all UT Austin library spaces should be reviewed approximately every 5 years. Like we review departments, we review organized research units, we don't actually review libraries, to our knowledge. And the review should begin by identifying the relevant stakeholders, and then the review is performed by a committee that represents these stakeholders, right? So the actual review is separate from the initial part, or maybe the review committee, so it's a bit unclear who identifies the stakeholders, but some unit identifies stakeholders and then calls a committee, and then that committee hopefully represents the stakeholders, but the committee probably should also think about whether it actually reflects all the stakeholders or if somebody was forgotten. And then the review should consider both the current use and current and projected future needs, right? So what is currently being done, is that appropriate or not? And what do we need now, and what do we foresee that maybe we may need in 5 years or 10 years? And the review process may include external consultants. Sometimes it makes sense to bring in some outside firm that maybe is an expert in reviewing library spaces or spaces more generally. However, importantly, I don't have it on the slide, but it's explicitly stated in the document, we don't think the review should be done exclusively by an external unit. It makes sense to have the external unit as part of the review, but not exclusively. And then the final outcome should be reported to the provost, to library administration, the faculty council, and the relevant academic units. Okay, that's briefly outlined our process that we propose. And so now I open the mics for anybody who would like to comment. Maybe we put them up a little bit, and if you want to say anything, you can just step forward to the microphone. And we will not carefully track time, but if somebody just keeps talking and talking and talking, I reserve the right to cut them off and reclaim my time. Yes.
Thank you for this. These certainly all seem like helpful recommendations for the future. I'm curious whether you spoke to any experts at other libraries or other people across campus who have dealt with perhaps library spaces, so that we could have a sense of sort of what is the current thinking on this question in other research libraries of equivalent status to UT Austin, or if there's anything sort of that we could get our heads around in terms of recommendations maybe for future use of spaces here at the university.
Yes, so what we did, we did a lot of things that I may not all remember, so maybe if some of the library people can also help me answering this question. One thing we did, and unfortunately the person who did that part of the report is not here, we actually reached out to a couple of other universities and asked if they had a process in place, and if so, what that process was. And there's an appendix in the document that we posted that summarizes the finding from that. Some universities have a formalized process in place, others don't. Others have experienced similar issues that we have experienced at UT. So I think that was the first part of your question. The second part of the question was whether we had library experts that could help us. Sean, do you want to comment on that? Do you have a microphone?
No.
Maybe. I think you'll have to speak into a microphone, otherwise the recording won't work.
We looked at current literature and about spaces in libraries and trends that were happening in library space across, I think, the library world academically. And we also looked at sort of spaces and how they've been reviewed up until now at UT libraries, and especially recent ones with our Learning Commons, and looked at assessments there, looked at data around how we were assessing the use of the space from the users that it was targeted to. And so that's what we've done up to this point.
Okay, thank you.
Jonathan Kaplan from Middle Eastern Studies. I had a quick question. I really like the overall process, and I want to thank the committee for the hard work they've done in putting this together. I did have a question regarding what about ad hoc or smaller decisions. So let's say the library administration or say a dean at a college decides they want to repurpose space for a new usage. Does that somehow also trigger a review in this process, or is there some other process that addresses these sort of ad hoc decisions for space?
So that really is the second part of the next slide would be how do we handle space changes. I would say when we're at that point, maybe you ask the question again. It's a very important question and probably a question that we have to think a little harder than we have so far, but let's defer it to the second part of today.
I was wondering how a space is defined, because it seems like there's a huge impact on how this process unfolds, depending, number one, on who decides what a space is, and number two, what size you're imagining a space to be. So I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on how we even get to the first step, like what is a space?
So I think that we have 11 distinct satellite libraries, and those are the spaces. So the idea would be, so for example, there's a mathematics library, and I'm a natural scientist, so I know the libraries on this part of the campus. Mathematics library, life sciences library, chemistry library, math and physics, sorry, is one library. So those are the spaces. They're distinct sub-libraries, if you wish, and they tend to be consecutive space with people that work in that space that report to the library administration. So we're not talking about a small unit in a library. We're talking about the entire library, and it would be reviewed at once.
Sorry, I should
Sure.
have down there. So then the big question to me then is, how do we decide what the spaces are in PCL, and who decides how those are used? Because there's a lot of angst about some fairly top-down decisions that have been made about spaces in PCL, and it's not clear how that factors into the model that you've just described.
You want to answer that?
Because I did an evaluation of library spaces and how it changed over the history of UT, which was quite interesting. We started off defining library spaces just on the basis of square footage, and so PCL is our largest library. So I think that's the starting point. How we are going to use that, I would imagine, would come down to this review process. I think our initial task was probably what you're getting at, which is how are we going to use this space and how are we going to sort of govern that avenue. And we felt as a committee, as a small committee of faculty, and that we weren't really equipped for this, right? There's a lot of people who have expertise, and also the landscape changes constantly with the evolution of technology as well. I mean, even if you think about the history of the libraries, it's quite fascinating how we went from the tower, right, which was a vertical space, into PCL, which was a horizontal space. And that is, there are entire PhD theses written about how libraries evolved. That wasn't in our wheelhouse. And so I think initially what we envision is just like, what is the pure square footage? And then this review process would have to figure out sort of with the current technology, I guess, and the spaces and things like that, what's the best way to go? And if you're looking at us as a committee to tell you we need like 7 outlets per undergraduate or where they're going to be, that's not where
No,
we're
I
landing.
understand, but I think it is really important to think about what size does a space have to be in order to trigger this process. I mean, would this process have been triggered by the repurposing of the basement of PCL to become a welcome center?
Yes,
And
yes.
so okay, great.
We're again at the second part of but yes.
But I think that comes in right here. What is a library space? It's some subunit of PCL.
No,
And I'm not saying it's your job to figure out what that subunit should be, but somebody needs to figure out within PCL in particular, where there's so many different ways in which you could divide that up into units. Is it square footage? Is it function? Is it users? What is it? Somebody needs to have an idea of what the division of PCL should look like for the purposes of implementing this process, or else that's going to be where all the collisions and mess-ups happen.
Okay, so our thinking, which is really coming, is that any decision made about any space within that square footage of the library, if a decision comes from outside one of these 5-year review processes, it will trigger a review process, no matter what you're talking about. So you're talking about dividing up the space in a lot of different ways. We're saying any decision about library space based on the square footage that has been determined to be part of that library will trigger a review. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
I think so. Let's
Yeah.
go with the next two people that are standing, and then after that, I think I'll go to the next slide because it seems that that addresses a lot of the comments that you guys bring up.
I'm a classicist, as Deborah Beck is, Tom Palima from Classics Department. I think there's yet another issue here, and actually stepping one stage back from Deborah's question, it doesn't seem to me that we're talking about libraries anymore. I mean, the definition of a library, etymologically, every language I know of, whether you're talking about a bibliothèque or a library, is books. And according to the new, if you go into the PCL now and remember what it was like 2 years ago, it's literally unrecognizable. Reference rooms that used to be there right on the ground floor are no longer there. Places for newspapers and things like that, and periodicals readily available as soon as they occur and going back in physical form are no longer there. So to me, the horse is already well out of the barn in terms of essentially changing the whole nature of the PCL, which is a vertical space as well as a horizontal space. And when I go over there periodically now to see the diminishing stacks and pull the reference work out, what I see is things, instead of square tables where people could sit and do individual research, I see lounge areas, group meeting areas, things that used to be relegated to in the original construction. The PCL was there, and there was a university learning center right next to it. So it seems to me that what we have is an invasion of the teaching function of the university as a space element, seeking Lebensraum, and going in and destroying books in the process in order to take over the space and remove the books.
Could I just tag on to Tom's question?
And so I'll stop
Sure.
there because I think
Sure.
Rather than,
Give your
'cause,
comment.
I guess I had a related question because I haven't read the report carefully, and again, thank you. You guys did have like an impossible task, and I think everyone will agree with that, and no one's going to say that you should take on the enormity of this. But to me, that's sort of, the books are sort of the elephant in the room, and they're like, I had to read several times, and the thing about spaces before I found even mention of books where there's open stacks. And I guess to me, it relates to this question of how do we define relevant stakeholders, and do we define them all equally? And I realize you have other slides that you want to get to, but I think this is a real challenge, and especially librarians are culling stacks all the time. And so we can't say every time they want to take a book off the shelf, they need to have a committee meeting. On the other hand, a lot of us are concerned about what happens to our function as a research library when all these things are removed from the shelves. And I'm wondering how your committee grappled with that question and how that maybe figures into this process.
Yeah, so we wrote in a couple of places, and maybe we can write that more clearly. We feel it's really important that the different academic units are involved in those decisions, because different academic units and different disciplines will have very different perspectives, right? I'm in biology. Nobody goes in the library anymore and looks at a physical journal, right? That just doesn't happen anymore. It's all online. Even books, is very rare that you open a book. So clearly in that field, we can rethink how the space is best used. That doesn't mean that, say, in the humanities, maybe in particular in an area where people actually study the physical books, like look at old books as their sources, that's a completely different scenario, right? And you probably don't want to have a biologist give you input into how that area of say, the humanities should handle libraries and vice versa, right? And so that's actually why we as the committee felt we should not make specific recommendations about specific libraries. We just wanted to propose a process that hopefully makes clear that the academic units need to be part of this.
And Taylor, also in classics. I seem to be detecting a pattern here. I'll keep it very brief, and this is more of a comment than a question. It seems to me that that space is wrapped up in other considerations to such a degree now that that it's hard to separate them at all. And one of those other considerations is how books and journals are bundled. Bundles are often made as are decisions, right? That are made apart from the stakeholders. Frequently, they're made by necessity by librarians, and that's all well and fine, and that's as it should be. The difficulty is that many components of these bundles are purely electronic, e-books, for example. Others are physical books. Physical books obviously pertain to space in a way that the electronic books don't. The physical books, we hope, are there to stay. There's no guarantee that the electronic books or even the journals are there to stay. They're essentially Netflix, right? They're here for 10 years and then quite possibly gone thereafter. It depends on the nature of the bundle, as I understand it. There are all kinds of bibliographic services, I think, that are similar in that respect. Movies, right, that you can stream may be available this year and not available in future years. And so there's a certain degree of instability to these bundles, which ultimately have a strong bearing, I think, on questions of space. I'll leave it at that for now.
Joan, make sure your mic, oh, it's on.
Yeah, I
Very
think
good.
it's on. Is it on? Can you hear me? So I think actually responding to all these questions, a number of these issues that you've brought up are really not in our purview, right? But are for decisions to be made among people who are looking at digital collections versus analog collections. Our job was to try and decide, and the way we defined our job was to try and decide how these decisions should be made. And the thing that we really came around to emphasizing is that none of these decisions should be made without involving stakeholders. I mean, what did we learn from last year? Is that we need to define who the stakeholders are, we're going to get to that, but that is the most important thing that we can do. And we can't decide how we're going to allocate space 5 years from now, 1 year from now. We can't decide across disciplines, as Klaus was saying. So I don't mean to say that these aren't really important questions, but that one of the things we learned is that not just definitions of physical space, that's pretty similar, but definitions of what people want from space really has changed over the last 5 years. For example, students want meeting rooms in libraries, and they want them to be in libraries. They may not touch the books, but they want to be by the books. They want to be next to the books. That, we all decided, was a very important finding and a good thing, right? We need to keep the books there, not because they're wallpaper, but because the students want access to them, in theory. And that's a psychological fact that we need to take into consideration when we think about students as stakeholders. So we just want no decisions to come from above that are unilateral, that can be put into effect when stakeholders aren't, thank you, consulted. We want some feedback on who those stakeholders are, and I think Julia brought up a really good point, which is how those stakeholders are hierarchicalized. But maybe, actually, Tom, can we just move on? Because I think probably a lot of these questions are going to be addressed.
Okay, the last comment before I move on.
I'm not going to go on and on, but you actually did say, well, would a classicist want a biologist commenting on, well, I was just reading the Plan 2 course proposals for our meeting on Wednesday, and 2 of the people are in natural sciences, and one's doing a course on the history of evolution. And, concepts going all the way back to Pliny and coming up to the current states. So one of the reasons to have a library with physical books is that, what Rabin mentioned, things disappear online. I just had somebody compiling for my research program the last 30 years of articles, and I would say about 45% of the links are broken. either because whoever was generating the link is no longer there or because they changed platforms. And this has even happened in our faculty council. All the history of the faculty council meetings, because they changed a platform, is no longer accessible online. It's only available in PDF scans, which means you can't go and search and find, well, in a particular year, how was this issue addressed? So it really is problematical when you destroy physical materials. Don't keep physical materials, just because now in the present time, things are available online. We benefit from this in classics too. I can sit at home and get, the Inscriptiones Credicae from 1890. I can find that online. It's wonderful. But it doesn't mean that I want to be in a place that doesn't have Inscriptiones Credicae in.
Yes, I'll move on. There'll be more time to comment. I just want to reiterate that our committee does not make any specific recommendation about for or against any particular use, right? I'm not defending removal of stacks here. I'm not defending more stacks. I'm just saying if we either reduce or increase number of stacks, there need to be experts in that area that look at what we're proposing to do and think it through carefully. Okay, so with that, proposed process for space changes. So on the one hand, there should be a regular review, but regardless of whether there is a review or not, sometimes some unit may want to make a change in space. And so we feel strongly that if somebody wants to make a change to space, it should start with a review, right? If we just did a review and the review makes a proposal of how space should be changed, then we have already addressed this point. But if it's driven by something else, then it should trigger a review, and the review then should be exactly as the previous bullet points laid out. And so then once we have the review, then there should be a document which we call call for comment that describes the proposed changes, right? So this is the unit that wants to make these changes is most likely going to be a dean's office or the provost's office, something like that. I think it's at that level that usually these changes would be made. And so then this document should be shared with the UT community, and then there should be an opportunity for feedback, just like we're doing now, right? The document should be posted online so that people can make comments online, and there should be an open hearing like we're doing now where people can comment. And then, very importantly, there should be a response, right? The unit that proposes the change should explain how they did or did not respond to the concerns that were voiced. We feel at a minimum there needs to be an explanation. Even if they decide they ignore everything we said, at a minimum they should say why they ignored it. And possibly, depending on how complex the situation is and depending on how much feedback there was, this may require a cycle of multiple iterations, right? For a smaller change, maybe you can just relatively quickly ask for some feedback and then enact it. But for a large change, let's just make something up. We completely eliminate PCL and move all of that into cyberspace. Well, that maybe would require more than one round of... So yeah, then we would either, or the unit that wants to make the change would either request more feedback or proceed with proposed changes. And I think that's the last point on this slide. Let me see. Yes. Okay. So this is our proposed process. Yes. And now you can come back and...
I'm going to ask a different question, but
Okay.
related to this and perhaps provoked by Deborah's question earlier about what constitutes space. And maybe the question I want to ask is, at what point can we talk about having a space review? So for instance, when I first arrived here, there were separate checkout and reference desks at PCL, and now they have been combined in a way which is no longer clear to me who's doing reference and who's doing checkout and course reserves and those types of things. Would that have triggered a space review, or is it a more sizable space review like when they unilaterally moved microfiche off-site? At what point do we have some sort of space review? What what's the minimum square footage that constitutes some sort of space
Yeah,
review?
so that's a very good question, and honestly, one that our committee had not thought about, and probably we should think about it. Do the library staff have thoughts about this?
I can have thoughts.
Do-
I would consider it.
Please speak into the mic, sorry.
I would consider a certain threshold for space review. Something like a service desk remodel to me is a service, it's a provided service, not so much about space. There are designated reference and circulation components to that desk. I would think this would involve looking at a independent sort of branch library on it as a whole, or looking at larger scale spaces than decisions made around smaller services that should be done with inside the library.
Yeah, so as I said, we haven't really thought about it. If anybody wants to make suggestions of what a reasonable criterion might be.
I don't really have a reasonable criterion, but I do think that I'm not sure that small internal service changes are designated points, because I think the constituencies that are utilizing those services might want to have some input onto their change in a way which might affect them. I agree that the circulation and the reference desk does not really affect 99.9% of all people, and probably shouldn't have triggered a space review, but maybe things like microfiche or other larger questions should be, I think, involved in the conversation.
So I think maybe thinking about form following function. So if you think about a service that then you want to shift reference to checkout or vice versa or something like that, if you thought about the fact that that will then cause a space change, then I think that's when it would trigger it. So it wouldn't be so much looking at the service, it would be looking at should a change in service then cause a change in space, then I think it would trigger what we're talking about. And I also just want to say that some of the comments from before this slide, just we want to honor your varying definitions of what a library is, because it's changing. And it has to do not so much with books necessarily anymore, whether we like it or not, but with information. And so if you think about a library as access to information, then that is where some people are coming from. Other people are saying we need to hold on to books. And I want to honor everybody's opinion, because what we want you to do is, when there's a review, get involved with the review and help us come to a definition of what a science library should be, what a liberal arts library should be, et cetera, what a natural sciences library should be.
Martha Haley Butler School of Music. When you look at what a library should be, I don't know how many of you ever went to the Fine Arts Library when it was a Fine Arts Library. But when I came here 36 years ago, it was a glorious place. And it continued to grow and be a wonderful place where you could go and search and compare and just browse and look at things. And, you know, that library does not exist anymore. We have something that's very up to date, that's very snazzy, but it took 2 floors of space away from us, and we now have a giant Band-Aid on the 5th floor. We do have a task force for the Fine Arts Library that has met this entire year, and I thank the people, I thank Catherine, I think all of the people from the library that have met with us. It's been wonderful. I don't know how much good it's going to do, but and everybody says, but didn't in your college where that kid made a violin from a 3D printer, that's digital. That kid The only reason he made that violin was he was in the library browsing through the stacks, looking at scores, and happened to see a score that called for a 6-string violin. And he said, I wonder if we could make one. Now, if those scores hadn't been there for him to browse through, would we have Sean, making this 6-string violin? So before we get so progressive that we let go of everything that we valued for years and years and years and years and years, I want us to think about it. I really do want us to think about it.
Before you leave, let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Is there anything in our proposal that we're missing that we could
No.
add that would strengthen that?
If your proposal had been in place 2 years ago, maybe our dean would not have done what he did.
I hear you.
Yeah.
And
right.
I agree with, I'm sorry, am I not?
it's on.
Usually I can, yeah. This is why we're having this task force, right? This is why we're having this
No,
conversation.
we needed you 2 years ago.
We did, absolutely. And so the whole point is that we hear everything everyone's saying. We all want libraries where we can go and be inspired. I think a university should be a sacred space. I think it is. And the library is the center of that. And as Notre Dame was burning down this morning, all I could think about is that this is what libraries used to be, exactly what you're talking about.
Right.
And they don't have to not be that just because they have spaces for people to do digital learning or spaces where students can get together and talk, sitting next to books. They can still be that, but it should be up to us and not up to somebody else, right? And it shouldn't be up to one person.
No.
It's a community decision. We should be joining together as a community to talk about these things, about any kinds of changes at the university more often. And we didn't feel that we had the expertise or could take the time to gain the expertise to decide what to do with all the various spaces on campus, because that would require us to know everything that the other 2 subcommittees were doing. And we can't do that, right? We know there's a problem with digital sustainability, but that wasn't we didn't see that as our job. Our job is to say no decision's going to be made without asking all of you to make all the comments you're making today. So when we push back, if this feels like pushback, and I tend to be much less sort of compassionate and tolerant than Charles and Klaus in my responses, I'm kind of pissed off, and most people can usually see that. If it sounds like that, that's not what it is. It's just that we saw our job as coming up with a process so that what happened 2 years ago doesn't happen again.
No, actually, that was how I was going to end my comments, is I applaud what you've done here. And I wish to hell you had been around 2 years ago.
Thank you.
Just you in your response to Martha, you said, is there anything that we could be doing in our report that highlights that? And Martha, also, thank you. That was really eloquent. And I'm Julia Mickenberg. I'm in American Studies. I think this issue could be highlighted. This is the elephant in the room. I think this issue could be highlighted more in the report. It really feels buried. Like I said, when you talk about the uses of spaces, I don't think the word book is even used, although, open stacks, and it shouldn't be just books. We're talking about music scores and all sorts of other things. But the whole reason that the whole task force and the set of task forces were created was because of the controversy around the Fine Arts Library and the battles over, is this space going to be given to books and other materials, or is it going to be given to study spaces? And I think I think maybe a scientist was appointed to this committee because they wanted to recognize the fact that in many disciplines, people aren't using books. But for those of us in book or, physical dependent disciplines, this is challenging our whole way of doing our work. So I guess making that more visible and that concern that some of us, not all of us, but that some of us share, I would like to see that. Personally, I think that it could be highlighted more.
So let me try to summarize what you just said. So you said that we should, in our report, more clearly express the concern that some members of the community have about losing, let's call them books, like
Yeah, I mean,
printed
there's a list of all the ways
materials.
that spaces
Yeah,
are
yeah.
used, and it's in the third section, 2/3 of the way down, open stacks as an example of the, beneath lactation rooms and whatever else as ways that spaces are used in libraries. And as Tom said, for many of us, we think of libraries as inseparable from books. So, yeah.
Yeah, so to some extent, I'm in no way an expert in libraries, right? I'm an expert in computational biology. It feels to me that to some extent the libraries themselves are somewhat changing how they define themselves. Sean, would you feel comfortable commenting on that? Or rather,
How libraries define themselves?
yeah.
Everyone is probably obvious to everyone in here. Over the years and with technological advancements, many things have become digital in nature as opposed to analog. One thing that I do want to point out is the libraries, we also preserve analog materials. We spend a lot of money towards preserving analog materials in preservation quality facilities, which does provide access to them from here on to time immemorial as long as we can keep them preserved. So I don't think it's necessarily a question about destruction of one for growth of the other. But the nature of, for us and from, I think, a library perspective and from library literature and everything you see is that the nature of the, say, young and up-and-coming researcher in certain fields has changed. So there will always be differences among the different disciplines, which is what was pointed out in this report. But I think the general nature of things is that there's a lot of talk about research, and we're talking about new knowledge creation as well. And more students, that has been proven statistically and in research, want spaces where they can create knowledge together in a community environment that is a learning environment. And obviously libraries have adapted to that, and we continually do surveys of users and constituents to what they're using and what they want. And I think that's reflected in how libraries have changed over the years. And also with technology, there are requirements from your users to have the ability to use technology in your spaces in order to create knowledge, access knowledge, but also to create knowledge. And I think that's part of what libraries are trying to meet and balance.
Thank you.
Yeager. I'm a trained librarian who's in the Cockrell School. I did have one particular thing about this. My concern is that if there isn't a threshold at a low level, you're going to end up with a lot of inefficiency. Furniture in a room. How much do you have to change in order to set off a review? And my idea is maybe that instead of just having a single review for everything, you have a tiered review. So a smaller set of reviews, you're going to spend, $20,000 or more over a space that, is 100 square foot, however much you're going to set for your threshold, that at that level, a small level of review kicks in. And then at a higher level, a more extensive review kicks in, something that's going to affect a lot more people. And that might save some of the efficiency.
Yeah, I think our document was purposefully vague. We said a review should be done if there are substantive changes, and then the question is what is substantive and who defines that. It's a kind of thing where whatever you do, it'll be wrong, and you have to rely on people being reasonable, and if they don't want to be reasonable, then it doesn't work. I personally am always very skeptical of putting specific numbers as limits, because even if they're reasonable today, they may be completely insane 20 years from now, and then they have a tendency to just sit there and not be changed. So I really don't know what the way out is, but it may be to say there are different tiers of review. There's like a big review and a small review, or smaller changes. Maybe one could go straight to the call for comment without having a detailed review, or maybe for smaller changes it could just be a comment is posted somewhere and there's like some period of time that people can reply. As long as it's announced and people have the opportunity to comment online, maybe that's sufficient for smaller changes. Something like that? Yeah.
Can I also suggest, as somebody who lived through and was an integral part not only of this fine arts library thing, but the Brackenridge Tract crisis, stuff with the change of the undergraduate language requirements in the College of Liberal Arts, and I've seen again and again that when powerful people want things to be done, it doesn't really matter what's in place. I mean, I'm cynical, but I also have the experience that justifies my cynicism. And so one thing that I would really, before this goes forward, you really do need to get specific as to how the faculty makes its voice heard in this process. Being inside the Brackenridge Tract, I saw all the finagling going on. I'm not going to go into details, but unless it's really made specific that the faculty has a strong voice. Books were defenseless. 68 acres of natural terrain was defenseless, and one of the major things that saved that was a golf course. There's nobody to speak. The books can't speak. And when we've had this impetus to have social spaces again, the libraries were the easiest resource on campus to create space, both in the Fine Arts Building and in the PCL. But if you had said, well, why don't we use one of those gymnasiums in the Darrell Royal Memorial Stadium to have, let's convert that to a social space, there would have been a hue and outcry, because that's a powerful constituency. So please try to figure out a way here that the faculty, I don't know, will have some greater say than just having our voices heard.
Well, so I actually completely agree with your perspective, and I would say we wrote the document in that vein. Ultimately, if very powerful units want to make something happen, there's little we can do about that, right? So in the end, all of this depends on if people want to operate in good faith, then documents like these can be helpful for them to try to do the right thing. And if they don't want to operate in good faith, there's little we can do, right? So I feel on some level we have to assume good faith, because we cannot, in the end, we cannot do anything about people that operate outside of good faith. Like, I can write whatever language I want, and like a university president, not speaking about any specific one, but in general, a university president that just wants to act in bad faith could just ignore it and do whatever they want, right? So that's why I understand your concern. I don't know what the solution is, because I think in the end all of this has to be advisory, has to be recommendations, and then if a unit wants to ignore those recommendations and want to risk the public outcry and says, we don't care, we're just hammer through, and 10 years from now nobody will remember it, there's probably nothing we can do at the faculty level to prevent that. It's my perspective.
I wanted to follow up again on what Tom's point was, in some response to what Sean was saying earlier. I think there's a gradation of stakeholders, and I haven't had a chance to sit down and read the report because I've been busy with other things, but I'm looking forward to doing so. But the question is, you might, or suggestion might be to actually define what the categories of stakeholders are if you haven't already done so, and then in that definition give further weight to faculty voice as the primary voice in making decisions about what happens in particular library spaces. Because there's a tendency, I think, in the current space considerations to privilege other voices as priority voices. Even in discussions about what happens in the library space, those certainly, and maybe to rightly degree, preference undergraduate learning outcomes. Is that the most important value in a long term for the library? I don't know, but I'm raising that as a point for us to consider. Who are the stakeholders who are here longer, who have a more long-term role in shaping the culture of the university, and maybe there might be a way to structure the gradation of them in developing these task forces.
Okay. Any other comments? Let me maybe go to the last slide. So this is such a long URL that it's almost useless, but if you wanted to, you could very quickly type it down. And so on this side, this is the site for the task force, and probably since you're here, you already know where that site is anyways. So our draft document is posted there. There's also an opportunity for you to go there and provide feedback by typing in comments. So we are recording this. We should be carefully keeping track of what has been said, but I would actually encourage you that if you feel strongly about anything in particular, put it down in writing through the website. That's probably the best way that you can make sure that we actually have it exactly the way that you intend to say it. And we've already talked about many different things, but I would still open up the floor now for any other comments, anything that hasn't really been addressed yet, or anything that you want to say. Yes?
Martha Haley, Butler School of Music. We had a committee meeting, the Fine Arts Library Committee that I talked about this morning, and I learned something that I didn't know about, and one of the things was 2 more acronyms to know. That's what you need, is more acronyms. But I think it's the JFL? JLF is a repository close to A&M, and many of our materials went there. And I think one of the faculty members was talking about collections and what we were going to be able to get back that had been taken away from us. And Catherine said something about, and Catherine, you have to tell me, joint something. What? Giant library what? Joint. Yes, yes. That we might not be able to get some things back because someone else says, well, no, we want them to stay here, or so do you all have anything to do with those spaces that are these repositories, or you're just doing libraries?
So, yeah, I think we are specifically looking at library spaces on campus, and what you're describing to me sounds more like a collections question.
Yes.
Right? To what extent, where are collections held and how are they preserved and so on.
So we just have no options to possibly get really valuable collections that we need back?
I don't know if you have options or not. I'm just saying that this is outside the purview of this specific subcommittee. Right? Remember, there were 3 subcommittees. Now I'm going to embarrass myself when I can't remember them. There was the space subcommittee, there was the digital collections.
Right, and there was the first one.
Oh, digital scholarship and collections more broadly, right? Is that correct? Collections, digital scholarship, and space.
Okay.
Off the top of my head, I would think that what you just mentioned is primarily a collections issue rather than a space issue.
Okay.
Would you guys agree? Yeah.
I'll also email Catherine.
Not necessarily directly relevant to the question of the spaces, but of course it is relevant in the sense that it affects all of us and the future of libraries. I just wanted to kind of make a public record of a couple of things we on the collections subcommittee have been trying to figure out. Issues related I'm Stephanie Mulder. I'm in the art history department. I always forget that we should introduce ourselves in these types of things, and I'm also a member of the collections subcommittee. And I just wanted to kind of give us a sense of perspective on the budgetary question, because this is something that impacts all of our subcommittee's work. Just so that we're all sort of on the same page about this, the university's annual operating budget in financial year 2019 is $3 billion. The library budget for financial year 19 is $26.2 million. The library's budget, in other words, is 0.87% of the university's annual budget. That means that it is less than 1% of the university's annual operating budget. So I think, once again, we come back to the question of our library budget having been flatlined for the last 10 years. And all of these questions related to digital scholarships, spaces, collections, no matter how you look at this question, we cannot move forward if we don't have a strong investment in recurring funds. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Name is Greg Lipscomb. I'm on the council, advisory council to the libraries. I want to commend the subcommittee for setting up a process rather than trying to decide which space survives and which does not. I think some of us were holding our breath to see what the approach you might take, so it's very critical. I also hope you will continue to state, you do state in there, but emphasize this is a process of decades. This has been a pattern over a long period of time. Current administration, the current directors made some decisions, but a lot of those were inherited, and it's been, like I say, a pattern that you point out. And so I think it should be more, just underline that fact that it's been part of the long-term fabric. And finally, this is, I'm probably about as bookish as any layperson can be, but contrary, or somewhat in contrast with some of what's been stated, I think the definition of libraries, both public and academic, particularly and including undergraduate, has changed and is changing. And I'm not saying it's all good, but it's more of a mosaic. It's more of a, as has been pointed out, the library is sort of the front door of the university for many functions. I think the students want the writing center in there. Your report calls it a campus partner, which is fine. But if you look at the subject matters in the writing center, they're all about words and books and how to approach them, or digital, and how to do that. There's a public speaking center. Again, it's use of words and putting them into action. There are tutors for the sciences lined up in the evenings. That did not used to be, in the library. You could stick it over in the learning center, but you start dividing thinking into 2 or 3 buildings for one continuous project, and the students will give up, I think. I just think that that's something that the committee also just keep in mind in terms of space, that the definition of what is a library is changing pretty dramatically nationwide. And I come from the era when you walked into the tower and there was a desk and it was silence and there were no people around. It was just, and now it's a beehive. Now, is it a beehive of constructively and around knowledge, or is it a social factor? A step back from that, I don't know. But it's exciting to some of us to see the level of activity and interest and enthusiasm in the libraries today.
For the record, my department uses a significant chunk of the tower for our plant collections, which is essentially a library of plant materials. So the tower is still being used actually as a place to store collections. It's just now it's dried plants instead of books. Okay, we've been here for about an hour, so maybe that's a good time to close this meeting. I thank everybody for coming, and once again, if you wouldn't mind writing some things, giving us feedback in writing through this form is maybe the best way to make sure that we really have exactly what you mean rather than what we remember you said in this meeting. Thank you.